Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I read a module and then talk about it for however long I see fit. You might notice the video looks a little different, and that's because I'm recording this at night. So, just to quickly explain why, I know in the past I mentioned, I believe, that they're doing construction around my house, which is true and it's still going on. They are no longer doing construction around my house, they are now literally on my street. So I basically cannot record during the day. Couple that with the fact that the dogs still frequently bark, and I suddenly, over the past like 2 weeks, have had no real good opportunity to record these videos. So I said, okay, so I went out and I bought some lights, and I have some very, very bright white lights now, and I cannot believe how bright it is in this room, and I figured, let's give it a shot recording it at night. The only other video I did at night was Tomb of Horrors, and it looked terrible because I had an awful, like, yellow light. These are very bright. It is amazing that any room with me in it could somehow be made brighter, because I really brighten up a room, not because of my sunny demeanor and, attitude, more so because I'm whiter than mayonnaise. It is very blinding. It's actually a safety hazard for most other people that are in the room with me. So it's somewhat amazing, but we're going to give this a whirl. Hopefully it looks okay, and we'll go from there. And if it looks terrible, I guess we won't do it again. Although there will probably be one more video like this, because I need to get videos done, and this is when I have an opportunity to do it. But the topic of this video is going to be the orange version of Palace of the Silver Princess. Now, I apologize for the fact that this cover did not print super amazingly, but it's just way too much color for even my pretty powerful printer to really make sense of, so it is a bit blurry. Everything else, I swear, all the other pages are quite well printed, however. So now, anyone that knows anything about this module will be completely unsurprised that I do not own an original version of the orange cover of Palace of the Silver Princess, and that is because it is pretty much one of, if not the most valuable / kind of rarest module that can be found on the market. And the main reason for that is that it was actually canceled. So if you don't know the story of this module, it was the first module that was actually the first real tabletop module that was actually written by a woman. This was written by one Jean Wells. And in that respect, it was quite the groundbreaking piece of work with respect to the fact that at that time, tabletop gaming, whether D&D or otherwise, was almost just entirely a male-dominated industry. And unfortunately, though, it's gotten much, much better in recent years, still is in some respects. But that was sort of the big deal about this module, that it was written by a woman. And Wells wrote it, did everything, and they obviously made the module and had it all printed. And the story goes that, after it was printed, it was eventually scrapped. The reason for why it was scrapped is changes depending on the opinion of the person talking. So a lot of people have weighed in: Frank Metzger, Gary Gygax himself, Jean Wells herself, pretty much everyone that was at TSR at the time that may have been associated with this module has sort of weighed in one way or another as to why it was actually canceled. The prevailing sort of SparkNotes summary is that it seemed to have something to do with the fact that the executives at TSR objected to a lot of the imagery, which I'll show you in a moment. Objected to a lot of the imagery, as well as the fact that some of the people did not think the module was particularly great from a gameplay / quality standpoint. Again, the variations, there are a lot of variations of that story. It seems to differ a little bit depending on who's telling the story, but that seems to be the general conclusion. You can actually go on the Essayum. Love the Essayum. Link them in the description of every one of these videos, where they've actually chronicled like a lot of the discussions that some of the people at TSR at the time have had about this module. But yes, this orange version of the overwhelming majority, only a couple hundred survived at the time, and nowadays the Essayum, I think they said they think there's only about 100 left in the world today. They were just pulped. When the executives decided they didn't want to move forward with it, they pulped it all and eventually had a man by the name of Tom Moldvay rewrite it. And when they rewrote it, it then printed with a green cover. When they did the rewrite, Jean Wells retained a writing credit, but there was not much of her original piece left. And over the years, obviously, this orange cover has become quite the collector's item, and sort of there's a mystique surrounding it because it is kind of like a forgotten sort of module. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about it is for a few reasons. And nowadays, much later on, years and years and years later, Wizards of the Coast actually released it as a PDF, this orange cover version, which is how I got it here and printed it out. Now, there are two main reasons I wanted to talk about this module, put it in the spotlight for an episode. The first one is very simple. And it has to do with the fact that this is, as far as I can tell, this is not, again, according to the Assam, not the most valuable module out there as far as auction prices and projected values. That is mainly because there are a few, like, really niche modules that were usually only made for, like, tournaments that surpass it. Not by much, but as far as value, surpass it. But as far as I can tell, through all the available research I've done, this is easily the most valuable module that was intended to be a general full release. Like I said, there's one module called, I believe, Up the Garden Path. Excuse me. Called Up the Garden Path. That, again, was only made for, like, one tournament in the UK. So, like, if you have a copy of that one, it outpaces this orange cover of Silver Princess a bit. There was another one, something with Daystar, which I believe was only available to people. I forget the name of the module. Oh, it's escaping me. It's going to piss me off. It might come to me later. Something with an R. Ratia? Something like that. So again, but those were obviously had extenuating circumstances attached to them as to why they're so valuable nowadays. This one was supposed to be a general release that then became incredibly valuable because once they decided they weren't going to move forward with it, they scrapped it. They pulped all the available copies. They actually took the copies back that had been shipped out from the manufacturers, and I believe there was like one box saved or something like that, and maybe some of the editions that employees got, I think I read. But in general, they basically did all they could to make sure that this did not get out to the masses. And as far as I can tell, this is really the only module that was going to be a traditional module where that is the case. The second, more relevant reason that I wanted to speak about this module was the fact that I have mentioned in both Musings and these Module Monday videos that TSR was not particularly well run. And I have done so without what I would call necessarily empirical proof. And my sense that TSR, I'm just going to flip through some of this stuff as we go on here. I'll go back and point some things out as I feel necessary. I have always kind of said that without really a lot of like empirical proof, if you get what I mean. And the conclusion that I came to that I sort of said, there is a bad shadow there. Yeah, we'll deal with that's fine. There are worse things in life. But the sort of conclusion that I reached, or the way that I got myself off. The way that I sort of came to that conclusion is just through a ton of research and other reading that I've done. And I think this module itself is a pretty decent example of that. Because when you look into, again, they printed a whole bunch of copies of this module, and only then did the executives get a look at it and say, not a fan of this. You would think that they would have made sure they were okay with everything that was being done before printing literally what I would imagine was at least several thousand copies of the module itself. You'd think. Again, I guess TSR did not think that to be appropriate. Um, because I imagine the pulping, like, I imagine it, not that it was like a fortune that they lost when they decided to pulp everything, but it couldn't have been cheap. And Frank Mensker, in his sort of retelling of what happened, he at one point mentioned, well, it was very easy to just scrap it because we were making tons of money. That's an awful way of doing business. Not to get up on a soapbox, but like, no matter how much money you're making, you really shouldn't just like scrap things because you can, like, just throwing money down the drain effectively because you have a lot more money coming in. That's a really awful way of doing business. No offense to anyone that may have been involved at TSR at the time. But so that's for one. Secondly, right, so again, getting back to this point of TSR not what's the word I'm looking for? Not presenting itself as a tremendously run organization has to do with the fact that this module doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So if you can see here, and actually it's on this inside cover here. If you see here, it actually says Special Instructional Module. This was designed to be a beginner module, right? So it was designed for low-level characters, for people that were specifically learning to play the game. And that is very evident. There are actually parts of the dungeon, which again, I can't really show you the dungeon because the map unfortunately did not print much better either. But there are actually parts of the dungeon, I can show it here in the text, that are specifically left empty, so that the dungeon master, as they learn and grow and become more skillful in the craft, can add their own sort of instances. They can add, like you see here, so there's a section that says Monster, Treasure, and Trap. The DM could then add all of that in. So that's fine. But the problem with this module is that it doesn't actually... It introduces a lot of new stuff. It introduces a lot of new enemies, specifically, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because again, if you were to task someone with making a new module, specifically a module for newer players, wouldn't you want to just, like, use the monsters from the monster manual? Because almost, not all of them, there are some from the monster manual that are present, like carrion crawlers and whatnot. But there are a lot, like, it has, like, the monsters are so different that they felt it prudent enough to include a bestiary of these new monsters. Which, again, if you're designing this for people that are supposed to be new to the game, why are you introducing new monsters? And even weirder is that a lot of these new monsters, like these barracks, which are basically just like three-legged rats, are just like amalgamations of traditional D&D monsters. So why couldn't the barracks just be rats? Like, I don't understand that. And I'm not saying you couldn't introduce anything new, but again, it doesn't seem like that's what the point of this module was. And again, considering this was Gene Wells' first module, considering this is something that was having time and effort put into it, you'd think that would have been said and specified from the executives at TSR. And yet it seemingly wasn't. And unfortunately, I think what you get is you get this module is very basic. I mean, most of the encounters like are self-containing from room to room. The story is kind of whatever. It's about a princess who unfortunately her kingdom is destroyed, and you then are now traversing the ruins to try and find loot. And it just, like, this is nice. The map is nice. But again, I just, throughout my entire time reading this module, I was really, really struggling between almost like the whiplash. Like, so the areas were so basic as to allow someone new to the game to get into things and figure things out and eventually add their own parts, and that's great. But then also, they wouldn't see any of these monsters in other settings, and also too, like, multiple times they espouse the ability to introduce this world into your own campaign, into an existing campaign. So it's like, well, are those new monsters then just only in the palace, or like, are you then supposed to take them and put them somewhere? Like, it's pretty obvious that, like, there just wasn't a whole lot of planning that went into this. And I think I think that's the funny thing, is that, like, for as much as mystique as this module has, objectively, I think it's pretty bad. And I almost, like, feel really awful saying that, because I don't want to besmirch the work of someone that I think was treated probably somewhat unfairly, because the main reasoning for, again, canceling this module was, again, the imagery, but none of the imagery is actually all that bad. Like, this was apparently the worst one, where a woman is being tortured by what's called a decampus. This is like an illusion. So this isn't actually happening, but it's a woman who's, you know, being strung up by by her hair, basically. This was apparently one of the big images that they had a problem with. And they apparently also, too, when you deal with it, she introduced new monsters called Ubes, which have 3 heads, men and women, and these are apparently caricatures of people that were at TSR at the time. Like, I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be Gary Gygax, fairly certain. And so, like, I kind of, like, feel bad about saying this module isn't that good, but it's not that good. It's not very good. And I wonder, to some extent, and again, this is total conjecture, I wonder if they almost tried to sabotage it. Because, again, this imagery is not that bad. I understand maybe, like, the argument that if this is a beginner module, you could maybe correlate beginner to young, but that is also not necessarily true. And there, in my opinion, is way worse imagery. There was one, oh, I don't have it here. Damn it. There was one, I believe, something with Tharizdun. I forget the full name of the module, but I believe it was something with Tharizdun. The enemies in that module are just Ku Klux Klan members. Like, white gowns and pointed hoods. Like, that to me is far more offensive, or could be far more offensive to someone, than anything in this. This is a little weird, I'll admit, some of this imagery, though it is well drawn. I think having some of these monsters, and it's sure, like, it's a little weird and maybe doesn't fit what they were trying to do, but I don't think it's necessarily offensive. Especially, again, in comparison to some of the other stuff that was done at the time. But I think this module, the way it came out, and the fact that it is very, very basic, and the fact that it seems to be at odds with itself, that it wants to not only be accessible to new players, but it also wants to be integrated into existing worlds, and it also wants the player to expand upon it, and it also wants to introduce new monsters. All of that just like, what was the game plan here, and why wasn't that sort of set up beforehand? Because then you wind up having to scrap it. And again, I think TSR's demise is not that like, this module should have never happened. That it's so sort of all over the place and confusing, and obviously trying to do so many things, and evidently containing imagery that the executives did not believe was appropriate. And it's a real shame, because some of the images, like, I love this one, which is actually of like an overgrown garden. I think this looks spectacular. The man who did the imagery, Errol, I want to make sure I get his last name right. Errol, where is it? Errol Otis. I mean, there are a lot of artists here. You can see the credits. But I think a lot of this artwork is really great. And I don't think it's like a poorly made module, although there are a few spelling errors. That's another thing. There's a few spelling errors in here. Like, where was the oversight at TSR? This module should have never happened. It should have... You should not have something that is so conflicted with itself that contains what people in charge consider to be objectionable imagery, to the point that you then have to, not after you print it and send it out to publishers, then scrap it. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And it's because TSR was basically flying by the seat of their pants. They were, because D&D was growing in popularity, they were making a ton of money, but this is also an example of how they were just throwing money out the window. Because it's the old saying of measure twice, cut once. This is the definition of measuring never and having to evidently cut twice. And what it's left us with, again, is ultimately one of the, or what is supposed to be one of the most valuable sort of D&D modules. Not because it's good, unfortunately, but because it was a perfect storm to make it into a highly rare product, because there was no oversight here. And I think it's a shame. Jean, again, I wonder if they sort of sabotaged her, because it was, well, they mentioned, like, after they scrapped it, they just kind of put her on desk duty, and she eventually left the company and the industry. Like, it just, I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever really know, like, the true story of what happened. Again, I think it's one of those things where you have all these different people giving their own recollection of the events. And the truth is probably somewhere in all of that. But I think it's just a shame that TSR's sort of incompetency ruined what was supposed to be a seminal moment. Like I said, this was the first module written by a woman. And it's just a shame that it didn't work out, because TSR was just not being run well enough for it to. But yeah, it's very cool. Like I said, you can read this online yourself. That was another reason why I wanted to talk about this, because I understand a lot of people maybe don't have access to the modules in the way I do. You have access to this one, so if you want to read it, like I said, I don't think it's particularly great, but you certainly can. I'll link it in the description, so you can read it yourself if you're so inclined. But yeah, this is Palace of the Silver Princess, and, you know, like I said, most of them were pulped, but now you can just repulp them by printing them out on your printer. But yeah, very, very interesting nugget sort of D&D history. And it's a weird one. Like I said, it's very basic. The combat encounters, the puzzles are very basic. It's just all over the place. And you know what? That's very fitting, because TSR, I think, was pretty obviously all over the place as well. But I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope this didn't look terrible. Like I said, I know there's a bit of a shadow here, but I think it looks like I don't know. Like I said, I think I'm going to do one more video like this, because the video to me is always secondary. But after that, we'll see, and hopefully get back to some natural light. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.